The winter of 1888 arrived early in the Wyoming Territory, and by the second week of November, the town of Larkspur Hollow had already seen its first real snowfall settle thick across the rooftops and the frozen ruts of the wagon road. Caleb Whitfield stood on the church steps that Sunday morning with his infant daughter, Mercy, bundled tight against his chest, his boots worn through at the toes, his coat patched at both elbows with mismatched cloth. He had walked 4 miles from the abandoned line shack where he and Mercy had been sheltering since the first hard frost, drawn by nothing more than the promise of warmth and a place to sit for an hour among other souls. He did not yet know that before the service ended that morning, a woman he had never met, seated near the front pew in a dress the color of a winter sky, would rise to her feet and say something that would leave the entire congregation of Larkspur Hollow speechless, or that the church deacon standing at the door with his arms crossed would remember that Sunday for the rest of his life as the morning he was proven wrong in front of everyone he knew. Caleb Whitfield had once run a small freight line out of Cheyenne, 3 wagons and a modest but honest business hauling goods between the railroad depot and the surrounding ranches. His wife, Mary, had died 11 months earlier, taken by a fever that swept through the territory that spring, and Caleb had buried her himself beneath a lone cottonwood because he could not afford to pay another man for the labor. The freight business had collapsed within months of her death, first one contract lost, then another, until Caleb found himself with nothing left but a wagon with a cracked axle, an infant daughter, and a debt he had no way to settle. He had drifted toward Larkspur Hollow on foot, carrying Mercy the last several miles when the cold grew too sharp for her to ride, exposed in the wagon bed any longer. Inside the church that morning, seated near the front in a dress of pale blue wool, Evelyn Pryor watched the door with the same careful attention she paid most things since her husband Nathaniel's death 4 years earlier, a fever taking him within days during that same terrible spring that had claimed Mary Whitfield's life as well. Evelyn owned the largest timber and grazing operation in the county, land and mineral rights that made her, by any reckoning the territory used, the wealthiest widow between Cheyenne and the Montana line, and she'd spent 4 years attending this same church every single Sunday without once feeling the sermon reach the part of her that still grieved. Deacon Josiah Marsh met Caleb at the church door before he could step fully inside, his expression already hardening into refusal. "We don't know you, mister," Josiah said, his voice pitched low, but carrying enough for those nearest the door to hear. "This congregation has enough mouths of its own to feed this winter without taking in strangers off the road. I'd suggest you try the town hall for shelter, not the Lord's house." Caleb's jaw tightened, though his voice, when it came, held none of the anger such a dismissal might have earned. "I'm not asking for a meal, sir," he said quietly. "I only wanted to sit a spell where it's warm and let my daughter hear something other than the wind for an hour. I'll stand at the back if there's no room in a pew." Josiah shook his head firmly. "This isn't a shelter for drifters and their troubles, Mr. Whitfield, whatever your circumstances. I'll ask you to move along before the service begins." Caleb looked down at Mercy, whose small face had gone pink with cold despite the blankets wrapped around her, and something in his composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "Of course," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize for the disturbance." He turned to go, and it was that quiet, dignified retreat, that complete absence of protest a more entitled man might have made, that finally pulled Evelyn Pryor to her feet in the middle of the gathering congregation. "Deacon Marsh," Evelyn said, and her voice, though not raised, cut through the murmuring church with a clarity that stopped every conversation at once. Every head turned toward her, and Josiah's stern expression faltered the instant he recognized who had spoken. "Mrs. Pryor," he said, straightening quickly, "I was only seeing to the good order of the service." Evelyn did not sit back down. She walked steadily down the center aisle toward the door, her pale blue skirts catching the light from the tall windows, and stopped directly beside Caleb, who stood frozen with disbelief and mounting embarrassment. "This man and his daughter will sit in my own pew this morning," she said, loud enough for the entire congregation to hear clearly. "And if this church has no room for a grieving father and a freezing infant on a Sunday morning in November, then I question rather seriously what exactly we've all gathered here to worship." A stunned silence fell across Larkspur Hollow's small congregation, broken only by the soft, startled cry of a baby somewhere near the back pews. Caleb stared at Evelyn as though she had spoken in a language he did not know. "Ma'am, I couldn't possibly," he began, but Evelyn was already guiding him gently by the elbow, back through the door and up the center aisle before he could finish the protest. What happened next shocked everyone gathered in that church, and it did not end with a single pew. Evelyn settled Caleb and Mercy beside her at the front, removed her own woolen shawl without hesitation, and wrapped it snugly around the baby's small shoulders despite Caleb's continued quiet protests. "I don't need your charity, ma'am," he murmured, his pride bleeding plainly through his exhaustion. "I only wanted a warm place to sit." Evelyn kept her eyes forward toward the pulpit, though her voice remained pitched low enough for only him to hear. "This isn't charity, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "It's decency, and this town seems to have misplaced rather a lot of it this morning. You'll sit here, and you'll let that child stay warm, and we'll discuss whatever pride is troubling you after the service has ended, not before." Caleb had no argument left in him strong enough to overcome both his own exhaustion and the quiet, unshakable firmness in Evelyn's voice, and so he sat, Mercy finally settling into a peaceful sleep against the borrowed shawl, while half the congregation of Larkspur Hollow spent the remainder of the sermon stealing glances toward the front pew rather than listening to a single word the pastor said. After the service, Evelyn led Caleb and Mercy out to her waiting carriage, while curious eyes followed them across the churchyard. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Whitfield," she said once they were settled inside, her driver Thomas Ashford waiting patiently at the reins. "I own a timber operation 6 miles from here that has run short-handed since my husband died. I need a foreman I can trust, someone who understands freight and ledgers and honest labor, and you strike me as exactly that sort of man." Caleb's exhausted pride rose immediately to the surface. "You don't know me at all, ma'am," he said. "I could be a liar, or worse, for all you've seen of me beyond a church doorway." Evelyn held his gaze steadily. "I watched you accept a deacon's rejection without a single word of anger," she said. "I watched you apologize for existing rather than make a scene in front of strangers. I've buried a husband, Mr. Whitfield, and I've learned to read desperate men quickly in the years since. You're not the kind who takes advantage. You're the kind who'd rather freeze on principle than ask twice." Still, Caleb hesitated, the same stubborn refusal rising that had carried him through 11 hard months alone. "I don't take positions I haven't earned," he said, "and I won't have this town saying I traded my daughter's comfort for a rich widow's pity." Evelyn's eyes flickered with something old and private before she pushed it back down. "Then earn it," she said simply. "Come inspect the operation, meet the men, prove yourself capable over the coming weeks the same as any hire would. If you fail to satisfy me, I'll dismiss you same as I would anyone else, but I won't watch a father and his child freeze in a line shack while pride keeps him from a fair wage he's more than capable of earning." Caleb looked down at Mercy, sleeping soundly now in the warmth of the carriage, and something in his resolve, worn thin by 11 months of grief and struggle, finally allowed itself to bend. "For her," he said quietly. "I'll come look at the operation for her sake, not my own pride's." Evelyn nodded once, businesslike, though something softer passed behind her composed expression. "Then we understand each other," she said. "There's a foreman's cabin on the property that's sat empty since my husband died. It's modest, but it's sound, and it's considerably warmer than a line shack with a cracked axle for a door." Thomas Ashford, who had driven the Pryor family for nearly 15 years, said nothing throughout the ride, though he would tell Caleb later, over shared coffee in the gray hour before a winter dawn, that he had never once in all his years of service seen Evelyn Pryor rise from her pew mid-service for any reason at all, let alone stand before the whole congregation and speak the way she had that morning. The foreman's cabin, when Caleb first stepped inside with Mercy asleep against his shoulder, smelled of cold stone and long disuse, but the hearth drew easily once he coaxed a fire, and by nightfall the small front room had begun to feel less like an abandoned structure and more like something that might, with time, become a real home again. He laid Mercy in a borrowed cradle near the fire, and sat beside her through most of that first night, watching her sleep undisturbed and warm for the first time since the line shack's cold had begun creeping through every crack in its walls. By the second morning, he carried her out onto the cabin's small porch, wrapped in every blanket he owned, and let her watch the frost glitter across the ridgeline timber. And something in his chest, clenched tight since Mary's death, allowed itself to loosen just slightly for the first time in nearly a year. The timber operation, when Caleb saw it properly for the first time, employed nearly 20 men cutting and hauling lumber down from the ridgeline to feed both the local mills and the railroad's constant demand for ties and beams. The foreman's cabin sat at the edge of the operation, small but solidly built, with a working hearth and a loft that would serve well enough as a nursery once properly outfitted. Caleb inspected the ledgers that first week with the careful eye of a man who had once managed his own freight accounts and found the books in considerable disarray, wages miscalculated, shipments poorly tracked, inefficiencies bleeding money from an operation that ought to have run at a healthy profit. He presented his findings to Evelyn plainly, without exaggeration, and she studied his corrections with visible surprise at how quickly he had identified problems her previous foreman had overlooked for months. "You'll take the position," she said, not quite a question. "I'll take it," Caleb agreed, "and I'll earn every dollar of it, same as I told you I would." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet, steady labor. Caleb rose before dawn each morning to walk the ridgeline with the cutting crews, correcting inefficiencies, negotiating better rates with the railroad's purchasing agent, restoring order to books that had drifted dangerously close to insolvency. He never once asked Evelyn for anything beyond his agreed wages, and when she left a basket of preserves and warm bread at the cabin door one evening, he returned half of it the following morning with a brief note explaining that Mercy had plenty already. Evelyn, in turn, found herself drawn to the small foreman's cabin most afternoons, first under the excuse of reviewing the corrected ledgers herself, though the truth ran deeper with every visit that passed. She brought Mercy small knitted blankets and a soft rag doll and sat rocking the baby by the hearth while Caleb finished his evening rounds, discovering in herself a tenderness toward the child that startled her more than she cared to admit. One evening she found a small carved wooden bird resting on the cabin's porch rail, no note attached, the wood still faintly warm from the whittling knife, and she knew, without needing to ask, exactly whose hands had made it, keeping it in her coat pocket for 3 days before she found the words to thank him properly. Late one afternoon in early December, a felled timber shifted unexpectedly on the ridgeline, pinning one of the younger cutting hands beneath a heavy branch before anyone could react. Caleb was nearest and worked the branch free with nothing but a peavy and sheer determined strength, shouting instructions to the other men as he went. And by the time Evelyn arrived, having ridden out the moment word reached the main house, the young man was already sitting upright, bruised but breathing steadily. Caleb kneeling beside him, checking for broken bones with the same careful attention he gave his own daughter. "You could have been crushed yourself," Evelyn said afterward, her voice tight with an alarm she hadn't fully expected to feel. "I've been closer to worse," Caleb said, "and for less reason than keeping one of your men from dying on my watch." Evelyn studied him a long moment, this quiet, capable man who ran toward danger rather than away from it when something he cared for was at stake, and found she had no argument left to offer against the growing shape of what she felt for him. Word of the arrangement spread through Larkspur Hollow, exactly as Caleb had feared it might. Women at the dry goods store whispered that the widow Pryor had taken in some penniless drifter she'd found at the church door, that grief had clearly gotten the better of her judgment, that a man with nothing to his name would surely take advantage of her generosity before the timber season ended. Deacon Marsh himself, still smarting from his public correction that first Sunday, made a point of remarking loudly at the mercantile counter that decent folk oughtn't scandalize the whole congregation over a stranger's misfortune. It was Thomas Ashford who finally spoke plainly in Caleb's defense one evening over coffee shared in the cabin's small kitchen. "I've driven Evelyn Pryor to that church every Sunday for 15 years, Thomas said. "I never once saw her stand up in the middle of a service for anything, not even her own husband's memorial, when half the county expected a speech from her. Whatever brought her to her feet that morning, Whitfield, It wasn't foolishness. That woman doesn't do anything without knowing exactly why she's doing it. Evelyn heard the rest of the town's whispers herself and let them slide past her like rain off an oiled coat, though the true danger sharpened considerably when a stranger arrived in Larkspur Hollow, carrying papers that would threaten everything she had spent 4 years building alone. The stranger's name was Cyrus Pryor, a distant cousin of Nathaniel's from back east, and he arrived at Evelyn's timber operation on a gray December afternoon with a lawyer in tow and a claim that struck at the very foundation of everything Evelyn believed settled. "My client contests the validity of Nathaniel Pryor's original will," the lawyer explained, laying documents across Evelyn's desk with practiced, unhurried precision. Specifically, the timber rights and mineral claims. Territorial law is unsettled on whether a widow without surviving children retains full inheritance when a male blood relative can be located and produced. Mr. Pryor intends to press this claim publicly before the Territorial Land Office at a hearing in 3 weeks' time. Evelyn's hands went cold despite the warmth of her study fire. "Nathaniel left everything to me by name, in writing, witnessed and properly recorded," she said. "That will not change simply because a cousin he barely corresponded with in 15 years has decided he'd prefer a different outcome now that the operation has grown profitable." Cyrus Pryor's expression remained politely, infuriatingly unmoved. "The territorial court will decide that, Mrs. Pryor, not either of us. 3 weeks. I'd advise you to have your affairs in order." That evening, Evelyn told Caleb about the threat over supper at the main house, Mercy asleep in a borrowed cradle nearby. "If Cyrus wins that hearing," she said quietly, "I lose the timber operation, the mineral rights, nearly everything Nathaniel and I built together over 12 years of marriage. And your position here, this cabin, I couldn't guarantee either would survive that outcome intact." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I buried a wife and watched a business collapse within months because I had no one left to help me hold it together," he said finally. "I know what it is to watch everything a person built simply slip away because the world decided someone else was owed it more. What can I do to help?" Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him in a way she had not allowed herself since the morning at the church door. "I don't know yet," she admitted softly. "But I find, for the first time in 4 years, I don't feel entirely alone facing it." She reached across the table and covered his rough, calloused hand with her own. "Tell me about Mary," she said, "if you're willing to." Caleb stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "She had a gentleness that made even the hardest freight runs feel bearable," he said. "I keep thinking if I'd gotten her to a doctor sooner or built us somewhere warmer to weather that spring, she might have fought the fever off. Instead, I buried her under a cottonwood and told myself Mercy and I would simply find a way to survive whatever came next." Evelyn's eyes filled with a grief of her own, carefully guarded for 4 long years. "Nathaniel and I tried for children the entire 12 years we were married," she said softly. "It never happened, and after he died, I told myself this operation, this land, would simply have to be enough of a legacy. Then a deacon turned away, a freezing infant on my own church steps, and I understood I hadn't accepted anything at all. I'd only been waiting for a reason to stop pretending I had." We are more than halfway through Evelyn and Caleb's story now, and if that Sunday morning at the church door has stirred something in you, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next tale from this same forgotten stretch of the Wyoming frontier. What do you think Evelyn will say when she stands before the Territorial Land Office in 3 weeks' time? Tell us in the comments whether you believe Cyrus Pryor's claim will hold up under a proper hearing. Now, back to Larkspur Hollow, where the whole county was already gathering to watch a widow's inheritance decided in public. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of gathered records and sleepless nights, Evelyn and her lawyer combing through 12 years of marriage documents and operation ledgers, searching for anything that might settle the matter before it ever reached the territorial office. Caleb worked the timber accounts late into every evening, determined that whatever else happened, the operation itself would show nothing but honest, thriving management should anyone come looking to discredit it. On the hearing's eve, Thomas Ashford arrived at the main house with something that made Evelyn's breath catch. An old correspondence file buried for years in Nathaniel's private study, letters between Nathaniel and Cyrus dating back nearly 2 decades, in which Cyrus himself had explicitly and repeatedly declined any interest in the Wyoming land, calling it, in his own written words, more trouble than it could ever be worth. The hearing was held in the Larkspur Hollow Town Hall on a bright, bitterly cold morning. Half the county turned out to watch, drawn by weeks of whispered speculation finally reaching its conclusion. Wooden benches had been carried over from the church for the occasion, the same benches Caleb had once been turned away from sitting in, and he noticed the small, unspoken irony of it as he took his seat with Mercy settled against his shoulder. The territorial land agent, a stern, unhurried man named Judge Holloway, sat at a table set up before the assembled crowd, and Cyrus Pryor's lawyer laid out his case with cold, practiced precision, painting the original will as legally ambiguous under unsettled territorial statute, Evelyn's 12 years of childless marriage as grounds for reconsideration, her 4 years of sole management as generous rather than rightful. When Evelyn's turn came, she rose and spoke plainly, describing 12 years of genuine partnership with Nathaniel, 4 years of solitary stewardship that had only grown the operation stronger, and the correspondence that proved Cyrus's own decades-old disinterest in the very land he now claimed to want. Then, unprompted, Caleb rose from his seat among the crowd, Mercy asleep against his shoulder, and asked the judge's permission to speak. "I've managed this operation's books for nearly a month now, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the eyes of the whole county fixed upon him. "I've seen nothing in those ledgers but a woman who has run this timber operation with more care and more honesty than most men I've known in my life. If this territory intends to hand her legacy to a cousin who called this land more trouble than it was worth in his own handwriting, I don't rightly know what justice is supposed to mean anymore." A murmur moved through the crowded hall, and it was in that moment that Thomas Ashford stepped forward and presented the old correspondence file, the buried letters that undercut Cyrus's entire claim by his own written words. Judge Holloway studied the pages for a long, silent moment, then looked up at Cyrus Pryor's lawyer with an expression that had gone considerably colder. "These letters, properly dated and in your client's own hand, rather significantly undermine any claim of genuine interest in this property," he said. "I'm inclined to believe your client's sudden concern for this operation has rather less to do with settled territorial law and rather more to do with discovering, 4 years too late, that his cousin's widow built something worth wanting after all." The crowd's murmur shifted toward understanding, and Judge Holloway brought his gavel down once. "The estate stands as originally recorded. Mrs. Pryor's claim is upheld in full, and this hearing is closed." The hall erupted, not in outrage, but in something closer to relief and genuine wonder, as neighbors who had spent weeks whispering doubts now turned to congratulate the woman they had so recently questioned. Outside the town hall afterward, Evelyn turned to Caleb, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You didn't have to stand up in front of the whole county," she said softly. "You could have simply let the letters speak for themselves." Caleb looked at her, Mercy still sleeping peacefully against his shoulder, half of Larkspur Hollow still murmuring behind them. "I've spent 11 months swallowing my pride so my daughter wouldn't have to go without," he said. "But standing up in that hall just now, Evelyn, I wasn't swallowing anything at all. For the first time since I buried Mary, I was standing for something. I was standing for you." Evelyn's breath caught, and the careful composure she had maintained for 4 long years finally gave way entirely. "I offered you a foreman's position, Caleb," she whispered. "I find I want something far more honest than that now. I want the man who stood up in front of an entire county and called this a fight worth having." Caleb did not answer with words. He crossed the small distance between them, right there outside the town hall, and took her hands, and in front of Judge Holloway, Thomas Ashford, and half of Larkspur Hollow, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of fleeting relief or public spectacle. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, of two people who had each buried someone they loved and had somehow, against every hard frontier odd, found their way to standing together in broad daylight. The weeks that followed saw the timber operation, the name Larkspur Hollow, still used out of habit, though most had quietly begun calling it something else, settle into a steadiness it had not known since Nathaniel's death. Cyrus Pryor left the territory within the month, his reputation considerably diminished, and Deacon Marsh, who had turned Caleb away from the church door that first Sunday, found himself extending a formal apology before the whole congregation not long after, along with a standing invitation that Caleb accepted with far more grace than the deacon had originally shown him. Spring arrived slowly across the Wyoming plains that year, and Evelyn and Caleb were married beneath the cottonwoods in a real ceremony. Wildflowers gathered by hands from half the county who had once whispered doubts and now came bearing gifts instead, and a fiddle player from the Larkspur Hollow Saloon donating his afternoon for free, saying afterward that he had never seen two people look at each other quite the way they did that day. Mercy, walking now on unsteady but determined legs, wore a small dress of fine blue wool, matching the very shawl Evelyn had wrapped around her that first cold Sunday morning. And when Thomas lifted her up during the ceremony to see her parents exchange their vows, she reached out both small hands toward Evelyn and said, in the clear, uncomplicated way of a child who had never known her as anything else, the word, Mama. Evelyn froze entirely still, one hand pressed to her heart, tears spilling freely down her face before she gathered Mercy into her arms, holding her the way she had once dreamed of holding a child of her own, in a life that had finally, truly, stopped feeling empty. Years later, travelers passing through Larkspur Hollow still spoke of the Pryor timber operation, though most had long since started calling it something simpler, the Whitfield Place, the family with the warmest hearth in the county for any traveler who came knocking hungry. Deacon Marsh, grown considerably humbler with age, still told the story of that November Sunday to every new congregation member, always ending it the same way, that he had never in all his years of ministry been so thoroughly and so rightly corrected as he was the morning Evelyn Pryor rose from her pew. They no longer spoke with the mocking whispers of that first uncertain winter. They spoke with genuine wonder, the way people speak of something that had, against every hard lesson the frontier ever taught them, turned out right. Above the mantel in the main house, beside the small carved wooden bird worn smooth from years of handling, hung Nathaniel's old correspondence file, framed now beside the church shawl that had once wrapped a freezing infant on a November morning. It started with a door that wouldn't open, Evelyn liked to say to anyone who asked about it, and it ended with the truest family I ever thought I'd get to have. Family isn't always about the blood that runs in a person's veins. Sometimes it's about the people who see a closed door and choose, with everything they have, to open it wider than anyone expected. It's about the hard bargains desperate people strike simply to survive a Wyoming winter, and the quiet grace that can turn those bargains into something that lasts a lifetime. If Caleb and Evelyn's story stayed with you, tell us in the comments which moment moved you most, the church doorway, the territorial hearing, or the little girl who called her mama for the very first time. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still believes a closed door can lead somewhere better. In our next story, a wealthy rancher's widow takes in a wounded stranger against her better judgment, only to discover the secret he carries could either save her land or destroy everything she has left. This is a fictional frontier romance inspired by the real hardships of the American West. And while it touches on grief, poverty, and a family's fight to belong, every difficult moment has been told with care and without graphic detail, brought to life here for your entertainment. Until the next trail, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stranger at your gate. God bless the pioneers, and God bless the hearts that refuse to break.